Hello and welcome to Belabor the Point. I'm your host, Kate Riga. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, TPM Associate Editor, and my best friend, Nicole Lafond. Nicole, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So Nicole and I just wrapped up talking to Karen Lee Ashcraft, this incredibly cool and smart professor at University of Colorado Boulder, who wrote this really fascinating book about aggrieved masculinity. It's kind of, intrinsic connection to the far right, how the internet is like a super spreader of this virus. And one thing that I was really struck by in our conversation, I'm interested to hear what you think, Nicole, is that the framing of this, aggrieved masculinity, I think what maybe most people know as like quote unquote toxic masculinity, as like an illness that needs like a public health response.
Right. Like a virus that spreads online and in every aspect of our communication and existence and how we view and just exist in the world. It was really fascinating and
Totally.
illuminating.
Yeah, because it's like such a good way of describing what we got into with her when how she kind of told us how it has such cross-cultural applications because it's so like emotion based that you don't necessarily have to have any kind of specific context to understand it, like
Right.
beyond the binary of kind of like men v women.
Yeah, and I thought you made such a good point. When you said this, I wanted to be like, yes, Kate, so good. But just like the idea that when something's a feeling, you can't debate it. I mean, there's no it's almost as if there's no point in trying, because if it's a feeling, it's a feeling, and people are gonna, exist and act and behave in their lives based on how they feel. None of us, a lot of one thing that we learn, like, as we emotionally mature, is like the only person that's responsible for how you feel and react to situations
Yeah.
is yourself. But it seems that, especially within this context, the men haven't gone to therapy. So
Yeah.
but it's the idea that there's no like there's no logic or reason behind this movement. It's a feeling. And yeah,
Yeah.
I thought that
And
was
it's
really
funny.
interesting.
Totally. And it like kind of reminded me of abortion debates because for
Mm.
decades it's been, the side advocating for abortion rights will talk about how like outcomes for societies that have abortion access are better by every metric, right? Like economic, like health wise, kind of psychological, that it's just like better for women not to have to carry pregnancies they don't want to have. But you can't
Mhm.
have that debate because the other side has always been like, but it's our religious conviction that it's
Mhm.
murder, right? And, to some
Right.
degree, religious conviction is like a dressed up feeling, like that it's not rooted in any kind of data or like academic research. So it's the same feeling I've always felt during that, which is like one side has all the facts and the kind of scientific consensus, but the other side is like, but we feel this very strongly. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, I guess
Okay,
that's the
then
end of the conversation then,
thus is the world, I guess. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah, it was interesting. And also the religious aspect of it. I was really happy to hear that she is another fellow I don't want to say ex religious person, but it is always fascinating to have these conversations with people who have grown up in similarly right wing religious homes. And one of my favorite, I said this in the conversation, but just in reading parts of her book, I really loved this idea that she has created and given, maybe not created, but she's given language for something that like I haven't ever been able to articulate very well. And she calls it lateral empathy, which is like, she can explain it far better than I when you listen to the episode. But it's this idea of, rather than reacting to like what people are presenting you with, it's more about like engaging with people on a level that looks at motives rather and like feelings behind what they show you on the face. And I thought that
Right.
was really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, the other piece of the public health thing that is really interesting to me is that it does take all that onus off of like individual accountability, which we like got into in the pod, but which is so always crops up whenever we kind of talk about like the masses of disaffected men. It's like, well,
Hmm.
they, the women didn't love them well enough or like didn't want to date them in school, and then they became like radicalized and like committed some atrocious act of violence. And
Yeah.
when it's a public health perspective, like that solution makes no sense because it's not, it's societal level, right? Like it's a
Hmm.
level up from individuals.
I think that, fresh out of a pandemic, we should all know how to like operate responsibly in a public health crisis. And it's a good way to think about it because, as you said, it doesn't put the onus on women to just like have better empathy for men, or women like needing to date men to solve the male loneliness pandemic or whatever. It's on
Right.
everyone, and it's on society. It's on like the systems that we operate in to change. So,
Yeah. And I think just the last part that was really interesting to me is like, I think we are particularly fascinated whenever culture war stuff that is masquerading as a problem of the common man,
mm,
when those things are hijacked by like, as we say in the conversation, but the Josh Hawleys, the J.D. Vances, these like Harvard grads who are some of the most powerful people in society. Whenever that transmission happens, there's like always something else afoot, right? There's always an idea that these culture war stuff is like serving these right-wing elites in some greater and perhaps non-obvious way. And I do think
mm,
in this case, cloaking these ideologies that are inherently misogynistic in something like economic anxiety, but then only interrogating that insofar as, that like uppity women and people of color are, I don't know, still for as they have been for decades entering the labor force, and we don't like that. There's no any like structural interrogation further than that of like, rent is high and the minimum wage hasn't been raised in forever. And tuition at colleges is ballooning. It doesn't end with that, right? It ends with like
right.
critical race theory or something. And I think that does such a service for the Hawleys and the Vances, because then these like Republican plutocrats can kind of pretend to be populists and pretend
Right.
that they are also concerned about the plight of the common man while consistently voting against any kind of measure that would make life cheaper and easier for, said common man.
Right. Said common man and everyone else. Yes.
Yeah, right. And everyone else that they're not as concerned about. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
So here is our conversation with Karen. I think it's a really good one. This is a topic that Nicole and I think about pretty much every day in our political reporting. So enjoy. Today, TPM Associate Editor Nicole Lafond and I are lucky enough to be joined by our special guest, Karen Lee Ashcraft. Karen is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, an award winning scholarly expert on gender communication theory and the politics of organizing, and a daughter of the religious right who's still in relationship to right wing quote unquote populists. Karen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Nicole and I are particularly jazzed for this episode because we're going to talk about something the two of us are obsessed with in our, daily political coverage, which is the status and evolution of toxic masculinity, what Karen calls aggrieved manhood, or what I really love, manly grievance. I love that. In her excellent book, Wronged and Dangerous Viral Masculinity and the Populist Pandemic. And particularly, we're eager to kind of get into the relationship of this grievance, to the political right, the kind of existential entwinement of these two things. So we have a lot to get into today. So let's just jump in and start with this idea that masculinity is, under crisis. It feels like it's
Mhm.
at an inflection point right now, but also that it's not a particularly new crisis to have befallen us. So,
Mm.
Karen, can you kind of give us a rough idea of the trajectory of this notion and like when it started springing up in our politics?
Absolutely. So, aggrieved manhood, aggrieved masculinity, manly grievance, all of those are synonyms, right, that I'm using to capture what is essentially a feeling, a conviction, like a felt certainty that real men, like particularly straight, white, Western men, manhood, are under attack, right? All this conversation, for example, about toxic masculinity sort of proves their point, right? That if you're a real man today, or if you value manhood, you're under siege, you're the bad guy, something's wrong with you, you're toxic. So you're absolutely right that this is in no way new. If you look back historically, there have been crises of masculinity proclaimed for so long. It's ridiculous. And all of those crises are culturally specific, right? So they happen in different national, regional contexts. About 20 years ago, I started studying crises of masculinity with a colleague. And we began with a crisis that was in the US around 100 years ago. And we were sort of comparing some of the themes of that crisis with the one that was emerging at the time we were writing. So, briefly, the history of the current moment is really coming out of a lot of the social movements in the 60s and 70s around feminism, gay liberation, civil rights. All kinds of racial justice movements. And there was an emerging sense coming out of those that the bad guy, the fall guy, the person it wasn't cool to be anymore was the one who was allegedly so privileged, the straight white guy, right? So we started seeing a rash of literature, films, all kinds of kind of popular culture examples of white men can't catch a break, basically being the theme. And then this has kind of intensified, taken so many different forms. And that's one of the challenges I'm sure we'll talk about is that it's hard to recognize the through line through some of those different forms. It can be as, volatile or virulent as Andrew Tate and as seemingly intellectual as Jordan Peterson. And so it's hard to see what combines all those threads. But it really has been on an intensification or an escalation ever since the 60s and 70s and kind of the men's movements that began to respond to those movements in an oppositional way.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, just kind of piggybacking off what you just explained, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the idea that, how are we even having this conversation when we live in a culture that, socially, economically, politically, religiously favors men by almost every measure.
Mm. Yeah. Well, this is where I like to borrow a phrase from Michael Kimmel, who wrote the book Angry White Men. Around the time just before Trump's election, he was following the Tea Party and kind of making these connections. And he described this feeling, and I can't emphasize enough that the felt part of it, that it's not necessarily an ideology, but a feeling, that it's real, but not true, which I think Nicole gets at what you're saying. If you look at kind of every data evidence indicator, it would be hard to maintain the truth, so to speak, of this feeling. And yet, in the ways that it circulates, it's passed around, it is absolutely experienced in the everyday by tons of people and not just men as very real, undeniable, like that's why I introduced it as a felt truth.
Right.
So I think that's a complication for sure.
And it's funny because it almost, if it's just a feeling, it's like impossible to disprove or debunk, right?
Yes. And I think that is such an important point because you'll notice that we tend to respond to this feeling in all the ways it presents itself at the level of argument,
Yeah.
or we talk about misinformation, disinformation, it's ideological radicalization. And what we're missing is that it is an animating, like felt truth that then attaches so easily to any kind of ideology, right? It can go so many different ways. So when you're addressing it at the level of content and not at the level of feeling, it's really not going to be a great conversation.
Right.
Because nothing is going to rattle the feeling
Mhm.
at the content level, if that makes sense. It's already experienced as real. Yeah.
And also this idea of it just like masculinity kind of being in crisis is kind of funny to me, because on the one hand it's being presented as this like all powerful kind of super important force that we need to maintain for the good and the order and sustainability of society,
Mhm.
but at the same time it's like fragile enough to kind of need protection or like bailing out all the time. So
Oh my
which is
goodness.
it?
That is, so you got the irony right on the nose there. I mean, this is one of the things that I try to elaborate in the book and explain, is how a supremacy this big is actually difficult to maintain, right?
Mm,
You're
mhm.
talking about a supremacy that is based on homophobia, white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, transphobia. I mean, all kinds of other anti sentiments, right? And not everyone who subscribes or feels the feeling would subscribe to those ideologies. But the overall kind of supremacy is pretty difficult to maintain. Of course, it's fragile because there's all kinds of challenges to it. And that's why these anxieties tend to intensify, and you see sort of a backlash around social movements that make racial progress, gender progress, things of that sort.
Mhm.
So I think it's crucial to realize like this level of so-called virility is inherently fragile because it depends on being at the top of the pack. And that's not an easy position to sustain. So yeah,
Right.
that irony is always going to be there, I think.
Yeah.
Could you maybe, talk a little bit with us, because, this is what we're focused on politically. We cover the far right, and the ways in which, it's evolved even in the past few
Mhm.
years.
Yeah.
So we're particularly interested in this kind of intrinsic intertwining of aggrieved masculinity and the far right. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Happily. So, one of the things I notice, I'd be interested to hear if you have different impressions, is that the far right and right wing populism, maybe other sort of synonyms or converging terms, is usually talked about separately from toxic masculinity, or we like to kind of separate, I think, in many ways, these different isms. And the difficulty there for me is that I think there is so much overlap. They are essentially two sides of one coin. That is, the far right runs on, it is fueled by what propels it around the world and has made it so contagious in this historical moment is aggrieved manhood, right? And so we can talk more about the details of how that happens. But I think it is important for us to recognize the synergy between these, and that aggrieved manhood is essentially like the renewable energy source that gets recruitment going, that gets people fired up about culture war targets, that is constantly drawing attention and energy and economy toward the plight of men today. And that has a lot to do with why the far right has been so successful, not just here locally, but on a global scale as well.
Yeah, and you totally just got at something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is how we're so, the collective we are so bad at kind of recognizing the misogynistic foundation of these far right movements. And I
Mhm.
think most recently that kind of came up, especially when everyone was trying to dissect Trump's popularity and kind of
Yeah.
how
Yep.
he won. This idea of, economic anxiety, as if that's a problem siloed off for kind of the white blue collar men who like propelled him to victory, and how like these different sects of the working class, I guess, just were devoid of such anxiety, you
Yes.
know.
Yes.
I,
Yes. If we could take Well, first, I mean, one of the points I try to make in the book and trace empirically is the ways in which this feeling, aggrieved manhood, has kind of hijacked or stolen real class concerns so that when we
Mm-hmm.
think white working class, we automatically think about a particular kind of white blue collar guy hero, right?
Yeah.
But I think a really good example, Kate, of how that happens is if you remember, I think it comes up every now and then still, but do you remember the kind of furor over the great replacement theory, especially when
Mm-hmm.
Tucker Carlson started spouting it from his rather large platform at the time? And everyone was saying, okay, it's far right ideology, it's white nationalist, like that's racist. But what we are missing in terms of the misogynistic foundation, as you put it, is that replacement theory is fundamentally about gender and sexuality just as much as it's about race. And the idea behind replacement theory is that white women have basically fallen down on their reproductive duties because they are out there, thanks to feminism, trying to have careers. And lo and behold, they're sleeping with men of color and having their babies, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is part of an integral part of replacement theory. But we don't talk about these as if they're two sides of one coin, right? It's white nationalism and then it's patriarchy over here. They, as I like to say, suckle at the dark web's bosom together.
That's really poetic.
I thought the metaphor is kind of apt. Yeah.
Yeah. You also just something you said just like made me think, okay, so this umbrella of like economic anxiety, right? Because I think to some
Mhm.
degree it's also easier to like pin a movement on that than it is for kind of quote unquote mainstream media, which is generally like very uncomfortable with kind of labeling things as like sexist and racist. And I mean,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
has never been more
Yeah.
clear than during Trump's tenure. But it also is interesting because that idea is clearly not really interrogated either any further than this idea of like, okay, maybe there's economic anxiety in terms of like non-college educated white men are having like more trouble in the labor market than they once did. But why I'm so interested in this is I think any movement like this that kind of distracts from the structural underpinnings of like why things are the way they are, I think is so useful. And like we'll get into this later, but I think might also explain why like right-wing elites, quote unquote, are like in on this as well. Because
Oh,
the
yeah.
economic anxiety is not coming through as like these, Trump supporters being like the minimum wage is way too freaking low, like rent is too high. It's like not really about any of these bread and butter economic things. It is all just this culture warring, wearing a
Mhm.
coat of economic anxiety, but not really talking about like the nuts and bolts of kind of why the economy sucks for a lot of people.
Kate, that's precisely my argument. You said that so well. I think that this is the role that populism is playing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
sympathetic form, right? It's like a cloak, like you just said. I call it like a gender laundering service
Oh
because
yeah.
it makes it seem like it's this uprising of the downtrodden, forgotten man, the average Joe, right? And in fact, it's like a cleansing device that takes what is all of these sorts of kind of hatreds, misogyny, racism, all this, and packages them in this very sympathetic figure. And I think that's a real caution that we should be having, especially since all of the data points, yes, there is real economic anxiety that is felt not just by certain white men, but by people of all political and racial and gender stripes, right? But we don't talk about class in those cross cutting ways. So the majority of folks who are supporting these far right wing sort of cultural war things that you describe are not, in fact, economically insecure. Many are downright elite. Or certainly well educated. So there's another element of that, like economic insecurity, which has to do with comparative or relative or perceived insecurity. So, like in my family, for example, there were both not college educated and college educated professionals, but all of them felt that relative to people of color, or relative to folks on the left who were, feminists. Maybe their relative position had been declining in the last 20 years. So it wasn't like they couldn't pay the bills. It was like, wait, I should be ahead of them in line, So I think there's also that, when we talk about economic anxiety, that's not one thing, and there can be perceptions of it that, just like aggrieved manhood, are real but not true, and are about relative comparisons that are yet again about race, gender, and so forth.
Yeah, there's just this other really interesting piece where, as you write, this is presented as a populist, working man's issue, but it's being routinely hijacked by Republican figures who are indisputably elite. You think about Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, J.D. Vance. I mean, J.D. Vance has his own history of complications.
Doesn't he, though?
He's elite.
Doesn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's just,
there are no better poster boys for that phenomenon of the populist posing of what is essentially, elite supported ideology. Yeah. And so I do feel at every turn, one thing that I am quite committed to is not taking an anti-populist tack about this. I am more interested in pointing out that populism and its form is getting a bad name here. It is being misused as a cover to make something much uglier, more legitimate. And so rather than being anti-populist and therefore fueling the sort of perceptions of elite establishment response, right? Which are like, look at these, lowly or stupid or uneducated folks. No, that's not the tack I want to take. I want to rip that cloak off and say, what is populist about this? This is, in fact, not for the people at all. This is about the reinstatement of the supremacy that has barely begun in the scheme of history to be challenged, of a very specific kind of person, kind of masculinity.
Yeah, it's so, it's the whole thing of if they can come for Trump, they can come for you. And it's well, why would that be the case? Were you born into a bajillion dollars?
Yes. But all the sort of tactics by which that felt alignment is made are so important to call out. And I see so little of that in journalistic practice. I mean, that's part of what I've been trying to call for is once you start attending to the feeling dynamic of this, then you start noticing these aren't so much like ideological strategies as they are like affective or emotional strategies. And you can point those out and debunk those in the same way that we attack things or respond to things that involve mis and disinformation. But we seem not to get a grip on the feeling, the emotion-based part of this.
Totally. Another linchpin of your book that I want to get into is kind of, the internet / social media as a super spreader of the manly grievance virus. And what is it about that that's been such a useful transmitter of that? Is it the communal aspect of bringing the disaffected men together as kind of an easily reached audience? Is it that there are women that are easily targeted online, something else? What is it about the internet that's been such a powerful, fanning of these flames?
Yes, thank you for asking that. And this is sort of where my communication scholar self comes in, because I think in these conversations, there's a tendency to say the internet did it, right? If we have a villain, it's social media. And mine is not an argument about any technology in particular or platform, but rather that the affordances of online culture wars have generated a kind of new communicative circuitry in the last 10 to 15 years, documented by all kinds of research, my colleagues in new media studies, information science. But suffice it to say, for our purposes, we're talking about a relationship between the network and the body, where we are increasingly susceptible to the physical transmission of social feeling, right? So we're actually talking, when I use the term viral masculinity, I'm not being exactly literal in the biomedical sense, but I am being more than metaphorical, right? I am saying that it physically transmits easier through the kind of networked organizing that we see today, right? Now, you mentioned that all of these communities are quite disparate. Like you've got your trad wives, you've got your pickup artists, your incels. Like many of these communities would see themselves as opposed, if they even talk at all, right? So, how should we think of those as organizing around aggrieved manhood as a feeling? Well, the thing is, the more they spar with one another, the more attention they draw in from all different kinds of bodies circulating around this network, the bigger the space they claim for this feeling, right? And that really is the point, is to grow the share of space, like the territory that the feeling takes up, because that's how it becomes more real. That's how it becomes hard to argue with. People feel it in Sweden and they feel it in Iran. You know, like how could that happen if it weren't grassroots? Am I making sense?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
this is how it's not just the internet, though that is a crucial technology, but it is about the communicative circuitry, and our bodies are part of that. What we need to be paying attention to now, in my view, is not so much ideological radicalization as physical radicalization. I might call it like radicalizing the reflexes, if that makes sense. And that is how young boys are particularly vulnerable to this. I'll stop there for now. You can tell I get it. You can tell I get all excited when we start talking about the technicalities
Well,
of it.
yeah, and it's funny that you bring up the trad wife thing, because I was actually going to ask you about it. And for, listeners, if you don't know what trad wife is, it's like this phenomenon that's kind of spread on TikTok that entails videos of young women kind of cooking and cleaning in full makeup and outfits, and espousing the virtues of being essentially a stereotypical 50s housewife. And it's kind of picked up a lot of traction recently. But is that, I guess, to just piggyback off of that, is that a tentacle of this movement, like fully? And then how, I guess, do women play a role in upholding this grievance?
Two critical questions. So, did you say a tentacle of this movement? I love that
Yeah, I
image.
mean, you mentioned it.
It's like, ooh,
Right.
octopus. Well, I think it is important to realize that we are not talking about a conspiracy or a headquarters or a centralized agency. Like that's the power of the internet, is you can have all of this highly fragmented, dispersed activity that happens to be in community because it's working toward the amplification of a shared feeling, right? So I don't need to make the claim that trad wives are somehow prompted by this particular version of the far right to see their close relation and collaboration, right? And I think what's really interesting about movements like trad wives, and there are so many, I mean, you do not have to look far, locally or globally, to see examples of women actively participating in and propping up this feeling. And what you can learn from that, I think our tendency is to see something like trad wives and say, oh, well, look, women are doing it too. So it can't really be about gender. This is just an authentically felt way of life, right? This is how it's populist. But you have to use the women who are propping this up and their particularities to learn about the masculinity that's in question here, right? So Tradwife tells us, ooh, it's heterosexual, isn't it? So, and
Right.
it is also hell bent on a certain sort of notion of family. And it's overwhelmingly, though not exclusively, white. Like, this is how you start realizing kind of all the intersections that are at play. We're not just talking about a crisis of masculinity. We're talking about a very specific strain. And the women who are involved help to reveal that. Now, I think trad wives, are going off of a particular kind of evangelical, religious right orientation, not always. Some of that performative, the way you described it was great. It's like a performative submissiveness. Like, look at me, Betty Friedan, 50 years later, loving the feminine mystique, making it look hot,
Yeah.
um, so, that could have a religious inflection, and there will be very different sources of women's participation in other corners and circles. So I don't know if I have circled around to the question, which was about how women participate actively, and I think we learn much from paying attention to that participation. But also to the question of how are all these things related when they seem so different. I think that is what is incumbent on not just journalists, but like the public in educating ourselves about this, to start to see the through line. And aggrieved manhood, manly grievance, no matter who is doing it, is the through line. It's binding January 6th to mass shootings, to environmental resistance, to the kind of candidates that we've been talking about today. Like, that is the through line.
It's so funny because I had never heard of trad wives before Nicole sent me the videos. Because
poor you.
I know, I missed out. Like, I'm not on TikTok, so I hadn't seen it. And it's just so funny how it the one particular video I watched, like, started on the same note as so much of this, like, more quote unquote mainstream kind of like male Tucker Carlson, whatever, that kind of stuff, which is the note of grievance, right? Like, this particular young woman was just like, everyone is like maligning women who want to like stay home and be mothers and have children. And it's like, you kind of, that's the natural jumping off point for her video. But it's kind of like, you hear that and you're like, who's maligning those things? Like, women are still kind of routinely like berated for not getting married and not having children.
Yes.
It's like clearly still kind of the mainstream path. And yet it's like, well, it's under attack. Like, by whom? When? It's like, those aren't the women who are being like, demonized for being like unwanted or undesirable or like failing at their womenly duties.
Yeah. Yes.
Not even a question, just a moment of rage, I guess.
Because it turns out we all have feeling that we need to get out there.
Yeah, right.
On these themes.
Yeah. I want to like kind of take an even darker turn, which is how these dynamics can and often do lead to violence. We have a good deal of kind of academic study showing that tons of mass shooters have histories of domestic violence. And the sublimation of women is nearly always part of, manifestos or kind of online activity that these people leave behind. And this is something that really struck me after Paul Pelosi, Nancy's husband, was attacked, because at the very most, when you had kind of pieces writing that up afterwards, they would acknowledge that, she's been this kind of right-wing boogeyman for the entirety of her career. But there was never any like prodding further, right? Like, why was she such an effective boogeyman? Why did she engender such hatred? No real interrogation of this idea that, like, she's been transgressing traditional gender roles for her whole career, like frequently being the only woman kind of in these most powerful roles in Congress. So I guess my question is just like, why are we incapable of seeing this particular kind of violence as like inherently misogynistic?
That's a great question. And I think it extends beyond what we might see as like domestic violence or clear supremacy crimes, whether it's gender, race, we're talking about rape, sexual assault, whatever it might be, attacks of this kind. I think we're incapable for some reason of seeing environmental violence and degradation as gendered. We seem incapable of sustaining a conversation about mass shootings as gendered, even though we routinely point out who the shooters are. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's as if across all of these different sort of violences, and I should add that another very important one, which actually hurts the very men that aggrieved manhood claims to benefit, is gun suicide, which disproportionately affects white men. So I think, part of this difficulty is that we don't think of gender as an explanatory device. we tend to think of it as just like, well, that's who's doing these crimes, but we don't think of gender as a motive. We don't think of it as a relation that calls people towards certain actions that are highly destructive and as something needs to be addressed in that sense. So I think, it's pretty important that we begin to name all of these different violences that you've mentioned as specifically gendered. And not only that, but that being part of this through line that I mentioned earlier. The Paul Pelosi example, I think, is pretty poignant because not only as somebody who watched for, 30 years as Nancy Pelosi's career unfolded with all manner of gendered attacks, then the attack is on her husband as if somehow that makes it not gendered, right? And I
Exactly.
think,
Exactly.
I think that's what you're pointing out. So it just takes a much more rigorous, I think, reporting and accounting for the connections among these. And there's all kinds of scholarship that demonstrates those connections, but it doesn't seem to make it into our public discourse. And maybe, a related thing that I would mention is there is a reason that gender is an easy way for movements and violence and things of this sort to travel. And that is because it's one of the only so called differences in the world that is articulated along a binary in many
Mhm.
or most cultures, right? So you try to explain like racial and religious resentments in India, translate those into the US. That is not easy to do, right?
Yeah.
The categories are different, the complexities, the local histories. But the idea of manly rights being violated, being wronged, is contagious because it's on a binary. Manly rights wronged, men, women, right? And so it just flows more easily and picks up all these other attachments. And I think that's why it's been so effective for kind of drawing bodies, mobilizing bodies to these forms of violence that then become imitative.
Does the existence of this phenomenon, this manly grievance movement, like make violence, particularly against women, inevitable?
Say that again, the first part of that. What was.
Just the fact that this movement exists, like it's a part of our
Mm,
culture,
mhm,
it's a part of
mm.
our lives, it's part of every
Mhm.
aspect of societal living. Do you think that it makes violence inevitable? I mean, or will we ever live in a world where there's no violence against women?
I think that question, I don't know about you, Kate, but that hit me in the gut, that question. And I guess what I want to say is I most certainly think it normalizes violence
Mm.
against not only women, but others with a capital O, all kinds of people who are othered. But I think in that way, we sometimes think of people who are othered, women included, as the targets of this violence. And they are. But the thing
Yeah.
is, what I've been trying to work toward is like, no, and I should say, and this is a public health problem because
Mm.
everyone is in the crosshairs of this violence. So the more we normalize supremacy crimes against what is essentially the majority of the population, women alone are half, right? When you start to normalize those and then see the way that they're perpetrated on the planet, at airplanes, in shootings on a mass scale, you realize that everyone is paying. Everyone is at an elevated risk. And if that, including the people perpetrating this violence, if that is not the definition of a public health risk, right? So I do worry. I certainly think it normalizes violence against women. And I do worry that it makes it more palatable, inevitable, as you say, like hopeless. There can be that feeling. But I think reframing it as something that needs almost literally public health attention would help us move in a different direction where people don't feel like, well, I'm safe because I'm not part of those groups.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's a really
I
complex question.
I want to get into the realm of like empathy, but real quick first, something you said just like made my brain ping, which is when you were talking about how the binary makes this so easily transferable to kind of other cultural settings that might
Mhm.
otherwise suffer to translate some of this stuff. But do you think that's where this like virulent strain of transphobia is coming from right now? Is it like a panic attack over losing the binary that has been so useful?
I rarely give an answer this short, but yes.
Okay.
I I mean, not only is the upsurge of anti-LGBTQ, um, certainly at transphobia, but all of this. I mean, if you really can like trace manospheric activity, I'm going to use that word,
I love
and
it.
that that is the source. It's not like those things don't have deep histories of their own that
Mhm.
are being summoned, for example, with groomer discourse and all those kinds of things. So, obviously, in their own right, there are important histories to surface there. But is this being rekindled as part of a manly grievance agenda? 100%. Yes. And you can track that globally as well.
Which just like makes so much more sense than when you see these things isolated in the wild, because if you're not aware of this context, then
Yes.
the fact that
Yes.
like every Fox News A block is centered on, trans athletes in women's sports would be like
Yeah.
baffling, because it's like
Yeah.
this isn't this isn't affecting that many people. Like, why is this such a
Yes.
huge focus of yours? But as you
Yes.
say, it's coming from a much richer tapestry, I guess.
If I could give an example, we think of the critical race theory
Oh
scare,
yeah.
right?
Hmm.
CRT in schools, CRT in higher ed, DEI, and then we might think of the groomer stuff that was coming out. And I don't know how many people are aware that in the U.S. context, there is the same architect of all of those campaigns, basically, Chris Rufo, who
Mm.
right? And so, like, that's something in the book that I trace, and it is so stunning that people don't seem to know it's actually literally coming from the same mouthpiece who is
Right.
designing these. He's like blueprinting, designing, and then there's all these kind of organizations around it that have created talking points and toolkits for creating what appears to be grassroots organizing in your
Mhm.
community. Um,
Mhm.
so it is, I mean, on the one hand, I cautioned against a central coordination headquarters view. And on the other, I want us to say, you don't have to dig very deep to see actual coordination as well.
Yeah. Ugh, that's nuts. Um, okay, so one thing I want to get to is this idea of like how to fix the problem, because there have been this preponderance of articles that I keep seeing. Like, there's been a rash of them recently that are kind of lamenting like men's loneliness and lack of
Oh, yeah.
success in the
Oh,
modern
that's.
dating context. But then
Mhm.
the conclusion of a lot of these pieces, either tacitly or explicitly, seems to be and and that's straight women's fault, right? Like, we're dropping the ball again, because they don't want to date you know these guys who hold these like right wing views.
It's a sanitized or gentler version of replacement theory.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
say more about that.
Well, just a moment ago, when we talked about the idea that replacement theory isn't just about white nationalism and the
Hmm.
fear of a voting populace becoming brown, it is also about white women's failure to breed with white men and
Right.
serve their reproductive roles, which is also connecting us to the trad wife thing now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this sort of idea, this call for empathy, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. I want to hear
Mm-mm.
the question that was coming out of that, but the turn to like, yeah, can't you empathize with that? Like that's a real loneliness, and maybe white women should extend an olive branch or do something for
Right.
these poor guys is is expressly what I'm arguing against in the book. And that's why I have this concept of empathy from the side instead of empathy from the front.
Mm.
But before I say more about that, I want to make sure you get to finish your.
No, you're getting right at it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
Okay. It feels that when it comes to manly grievance, there are two dominant responses, especially on the left, but overall. And one is oppose it, argue with it, right? And another is feel sorry for it, empathize with it. That will help to deflate the anger. And I do not think it does. Because if the goal is to suck up attention and restore the supremacy by doing so, I am the wounded victim. All of the attention needs to come to me. Then empathizing with that feeling is just feeding right into it. It's just expanding its share, right, of the territory that we talked about earlier. So, what I would advocate instead is focusing not on the content that the feeling is putting out there, but focusing instead on its movement. That is, instead of getting caught up in what is being said by incels, for example, in this case, right, about men's loneliness, or there's other men's separatist groups too, instead of getting caught up in those ideologies or those pleas that they're making or narratives, we would say, how is this feeling spreading? Like, how did the incel community explosively grow? Don't listen to what it says. Tackle how it spreads, right? And that's what I mean by empathy from the side. If we really accept that there is a new communicative circuitry, then we need to be focused on the transmission of feeling, just as we would the transmission of a virus. You wouldn't be spending all your time being like, woe is you with this, you swallowed this ideological poison. Poor you, you know? We would be like, how can we protect people from the communal spread of this feeling, if that makes sense? Now, that a very different set of solutions, and I put that in quotes because, of course, it's highly complicated, so it's not something you're going to fix, but a very different set of interventions comes out of that turn that I just made. And if we were talking at the individual level, like here you are with a very lonely man who wants to tell you that involuntary celibates, for those of you who don't know what incels are experiencing a lot of pain and deserve your empathy. You would, instead of arguing with the content of that argument, cut straight to the feeling level. Like, whoo, you can address like other forms of pain in the world, but you would go to the animating feeling and disregard the argument. It is not a comfortable thing to do, but it would be what you would, the difference. But then there's also, you could scale this up like at the educational level. We have so much training in higher ed on critical thinking and none on critical feeling. At the journalistic level, there's all kinds of educational practices we could be teaching journalists about how to uncover these emotional tactics. So without giving, there's also parental kind of solutions, interventions as well. So all of that to say, it's like a paradigm shift that then chains out into a different way of tackling this, then calling the very people who are oppressed by this into empathy with their oppressor. I think we can see what's wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, in reading your book, I love the concept of lateral empathy. And I think there was a line you said, like, instead of getting upset about someone saying fuck you, look at why they said fuck you. And I thought that was kind of a really interesting phenomenon, but also, it kind of helped me personally think about some of the relationships in my life. And you and I both grew up religious right-wing households, and I know firsthand about the difficulties in balancing the views of the people you love with your personal loyalty to your family and your love for your family and just love for people as individuals. And just learning how to I've had to coach myself and learn how to have thoughtful and real conversations with people I love that don't end in denting the relationship as well. So I guess I just wanted to ask, like, how has that been for you, and has it evolved particularly in and post the Trump era, where I think a lot of people experienced these divides and they became clearer within families?
I resonate so much with everything you said. I have had to learn the hard way as well how to reorient my own body to these conversations with family, where I have stopped debating the finer points of this or that truth or mistruth or ideological viewpoint. And instead, like you gave the fuck you example from the book. And instead of like mirroring what is coming at me, trying to slow down and pause and see the tightening fists, in my relatives as they're starting to argue, seeing them puffing up their chests and realizing there's something to defend here, They're like bracing. So then my interventions have become things like, are you okay? Are you okay? Really? Like what are you losing? What is lost? What's the, cutting to like, what's the fear? If all of this goes the other way, then what? Where are we left? What hurts us? So like at that level, I find that to be an ongoing challenge in my own life, right? So I write about it from having lived it. The intensifications of the Trump and post-Trump, well, is there such a thing? The post-Trump years? But you know what I mean?
Great point, yes.
The intensifications of the last now, honestly, decade have led to a situation where holidays together are less frequent, but we are doing our best, kind of one-on-one and in small pods, to have gatherings where politics are off the table. But the thing is, they never are, because everything's politicized. Bring a pie from Whole Foods and you're part of the feminist elite that doesn't know how to cook anymore, and you shop at Whole Foods. You know what I mean? So it's not possible to avoid it as it continues to mushroom. And so I do feel on an everyday, like life, love, relational level, challenged to practice what I'm trying to talk about in this book. And I wish you well too, Nicole.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to try to end on a positive note here, and see, in the past year or so, like since your book came out, or even before that, is there anything that you've seen in this space that has like given you optimism or some reason to feel kind of hopeful, as as you say, as this movement kind of mushrooms in the background?
That is a daunting question, and
Yeah.
the vital question. It's interesting that before I started the research for this book, I think I was more dismal than I am now. So maybe that's a point of hope.
Yeah.
That in the process of doing this research and sort of coming to understand at least some of the mechanisms whereby this has exploded globally, right? The far right is gaining traction in all these different ways. It feels to me like there's actually some opportunity for purchase on it differently. Like if we could make a paradigm shift, there are other modes of response that in and of itself is hopeful. I also, as not just a researcher, but a teacher. And one of the classes that I am privileged to teach is gender and communication, where I see a lot of men in particular who enroll in my class because they've heard it's not as scary because it's not in gender studies, right? And it's more introductory. And oh my goodness, the conversations we have talking about these dynamics, they so much resonate with both the feeling and the social media part and the online dynamics, and their ideas and ways of intervening in this with peers are powerful and interesting. That gives me hope. And also, I think conversations like this, where people are willing to, for a half an hour, for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, to contend with gender and not treat it as some passe way of explaining things or as a sideshow, that gives me hope. The more we can talk about, for example, the Proud Boys and utter the phrase gender and not just treat them as a far right group. They're telling us Proud Boys. They're telling us how important gender is to their agenda. The more we have conversations like this where we're calling it out, the more a turn becomes possible. I do believe that naming it is critical in this case. I don't know if that's as much hope as you were seeking. Maybe you
Oh,
can provide
no.
me with hope.
I don't know. I guess it makes me feel a little bit, well, it makes me angry, but it also makes me feel hopeful to like talk about this stuff, which is what you're saying, right? It's like, as while it's just this pervasive, unrecognized force, then we're not anywhere close to kind of cracking down on it. But I think, I don't know, it does feel to some degree like people are catching on, the kind of the same way that it took journalists, like, feels like sometimes the entire Trump administration to kind of like wrap their heads around him, like, to
Yeah.
some degree, the tentacles, if you will, are starting to kind of, I think people are starting to see them more.
I think tentacle should be our model of like how this is all kind of coming together and organizing. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so again, the really, really excellent book that I can't recommend enough is Wronged and Dangerous: Viral Masculinity and the Populist Pandemic. Karen, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Belaboring the Point with Kate Riga is a TPM podcast. The show is hosted by me, reporter Kate Riga. The show is produced by the excellent Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to our good friend, Why Not Jansveld, for our podcast theme song. And thanks to our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcast and subscribe wherever you listen.